In 1992, a bright 17-year-old girl from the quiet town of Millfield, Oregon, vanished without a trace on her way home from school, leaving her family shattered and a community haunted by unanswered questions. But 20 years later, her father would discover something chilling hidden in plain sight within the pages of her high school yearbook, a clue that would change everything they thought they knew about her disappearance. Kenneth Morrison sat in his dimly lit study on a cold February evening in 2012, surrounded by boxes he hadn't opened in 2 decades. At 58, Ken's once dark hair had turned silver at the temples, and deep lines etched his weathered face, telling the story of 20 years spent searching for answers that never came. The house felt emptier than usual tonight, with Sandra visiting her sister in Portland, leaving him alone with memories he usually tried to avoid. He had promised Sandra he would finally go through Jessica's belongings. They were planning to move to a smaller house, and these boxes couldn't follow them anymore. It was time to let go, Sandra had said gently, though her own eyes betrayed the pain those words caused her. Ken understood her reasoning, but his heart wasn't ready to accept what his mind already knew. The first box contained Jessica's winter clothes, still folded neatly the way Sandra had packed them. Ken lifted a blue wool sweater, inhaling deeply, hoping to catch even the faintest trace of his daughter's perfume, but 20 years had erased even that small comfort. He set the sweater aside and continued digging through the contents, finding her collection of cassette tapes, ticket stubs from movies she'd seen with friends, and a small jewelry box that played a tinkling melody when opened. The second box held her books and school supplies. Ken ran his fingers across the spines of her novels, noting the careful way she had written her name in each one. Jessica Morrison. Always in neat cursive, always in blue ink. She had been meticulous about her belongings, organized in a way that reminded him of himself at that age. At the bottom of the box, beneath her notebooks and textbooks, Ken found her senior yearbook from Millfield High School. The cover was burgundy with gold lettering, and Jessica's name was embossed on the lower right corner. He hesitated before opening it, knowing this would be the hardest part. The yearbook represented hopes and dreams that would never be fulfilled, futures that would never unfold. Ken carried the yearbook to his desk and turned on the reading lamp. The bright light cast harsh shadows across the pages as he opened to the first section. There was Jessica's senior portrait, beautiful and radiant, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her smile genuine and full of life. The caption beneath read, Jessica Morrison. Future plans, elementary education at Oregon State University. Quote, the best is yet to come. His throat tightened as he stared at the photo. This had been taken just 2 months before she disappeared. 2 months before their world collapsed entirely. Ken flipped through the pages slowly, looking at photos of Jessica with her friends at various school events. There she was at the homecoming dance, laughing with her best friend Rachel. Another photo showed her volunteering at the school's fall carnival, helping younger children with games. In every image, Jessica appeared happy and engaged, showing no signs of the troubled teenager the police had initially suggested she might have been. He reached the section devoted to clubs and activities. Jessica had been involved in several organizations: student council, drama club, volunteer services, and the school newspaper. Ken smiled despite his sadness, remembering how proud they had been of her involvement. She had never been the type to cause trouble or rebel against authority. The police had been wrong about her running away voluntarily. As Ken continued turning pages, he came across the drama club section. There were several photos from their production of Our Town that fall. Jessica had played Emily Webb, and Ken remembered how nervous she had been before opening night. Sandra had helped her practice her lines for weeks, and the performance had been beautiful. One particular photo caught his attention. It showed the entire cast after their final performance, still in costume and makeup, arms around each other in celebration. Jessica stood in the center, beaming with pride and accomplishment. But it wasn't Jessica that made Ken pause and look closer. Standing at the edge of the group, partially cut off by the photo's border, was a man Ken didn't recognize. He wasn't wearing a costume, so he wasn't part of the cast. The man appeared to be in his 30s, with dark hair and an intense expression as he looked directly at Jessica. What struck Ken as odd was how out of place the man seemed in a photo meant to celebrate the student actors. Ken reached for the magnifying glass he kept in his desk drawer and examined the photo more carefully. The man's positioning seemed deliberate, as if he had specifically placed himself where he could watch Jessica. There was something unsettling about his presence that Ken couldn't quite articulate, a feeling that made his stomach tighten with unease. He flipped to the front of the yearbook and studied the credits page, looking for any mention of adult volunteers or staff members who might have helped with the drama production. Mrs. Patricia Williams was listed as the drama teacher and director. Mr. James Foster was credited as technical director. But there was no mention of any other adults involved in the production. Ken returned to the photo, studying every detail he could make out through the magnifying glass. The man wore a dark jacket and appeared to be holding something in his hand, though Ken couldn't determine what it was. Most disturbing was the man's focus. While everyone else in the photo was celebrating or looking at the camera, this stranger's attention was fixed solely on Jessica. 20 years of pain and frustration suddenly crystallized into something resembling hope. Ken had looked at this yearbook countless times in the months immediately following Jessica's disappearance, but he had always focused on Jessica herself, searching her face for any clue about her state of mind. He had never paid attention to the background figures, the peripheral details that might have held answers. Now, with the perspective that only time could provide, Ken saw things differently. This man in the photo represented something new, a lead that had been hiding in plain sight for 2 decades. Someone had been watching Jessica, and that someone had found a way to insert himself into her world without anyone noticing. Ken's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his phone. After 20 years of dead ends and false hopes, he might finally have found something real. Something that could bring Jessica home, or at least provide the answers he and Sandra had been desperately seeking since that terrible day in October 1992 when their daughter had simply vanished from their lives. The clock on his desk read 11:30 p.m., too late to call anyone tonight. But tomorrow, Ken Morrison would begin a new search for his daughter, armed with the first genuine clue he had found in 20 years. The man in the yearbook photo was out there somewhere, and Ken was determined to find him. Ken Morrison barely slept that night, his mind racing with possibilities and questions that had been dormant for 2 decades. When dawn finally broke over Millfield, he was already sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee, the yearbook open in front of him, studying the mysterious man in the drama club photo under the morning light. At exactly 8 a.m., Ken dialed Millfield High School. The receptionist who answered had a young voice, certainly someone who hadn't been there during Jessica's time. Ken explained that he was trying to reach someone who might have records from 1992, specifically about the drama department and their production of Our Town. After several transfers, Ken found himself speaking with Mrs. Dorothy Chen, the school's longtime secretary who had worked there for over 30 years. Her voice warmed immediately when Ken mentioned his name. "Mr. Morrison, of course I remember you and Sandra," Mrs. Chen said softly. "And Jessica. Such a sweet girl. I think about her often, especially this time of year when we're putting together the spring drama production. How are you and Sandra doing?" Ken's throat tightened at her genuine concern. "We're managing, Mrs. Chen. Actually, I'm calling because I found something in Jessica's yearbook that I'd never noticed before. There's a man in one of the drama club photos who doesn't seem to belong there. I was hoping you might remember something about who helped with the production that year." There was a pause before Mrs. Chen responded. "Well, let me think. Mrs. Williams directed the play, of course, and Mr. Foster handled the technical aspects. But if I remember correctly, we did have some volunteer help that year from the community. Let me check our old files." Ken heard the rustling of papers through the phone. His heart pounded as he waited, hoping that after all these years, some record might still exist. "Here we are," Mrs. Chen said after several minutes. 1992 fall production records. "Yes, we had several parent volunteers for costumes and props and—" She paused and Ken could hear her turning pages. "There's a note here about someone helping with photography. A Mr. Thomas? The last name is smudged, but it looks like it might be Garrett or Garrett." "Photography?" Ken asked, his pulse quickening. Was this person officially associated with the school? No, it appears he was an independent volunteer. The note says he offered to take professional photos of the production for the yearbook and student newspaper. Mrs. Williams approved it because our usual photographer was unavailable that week. Ken stared at the yearbook photo, his stomach churning. A photographer would have had legitimate access to rehearsals and performances. He would have been able to observe Jessica closely without raising suspicion. Most importantly, he would have been in a position to approach students under the guise of his photographic duties. "Mrs. Chen, do you remember anything else about this man? What he looked like, how old he was?" "Oh my, that was so long ago," she replied thoughtfully. "I do remember he was quite insistent about getting good shots of all the students. Some of the teachers mentioned he seemed very thorough in his work. But I'm afraid I don't recall much about his appearance." Ken's mind raced. This Thomas Garrett, or whatever his real name was, had inserted himself into Jessica's world with the perfect cover story. He could photograph the students, learn their schedules, even follow them home under the pretense of taking candid shots for the yearbook. "Mrs. Chin, Would you happen to have any contact information for this photographer? An address or phone number? Let me check, she said, though her tone suggested she doubted anything would still be current after 20 years. After a few moments, she returned to the phone. I'm sorry, Mr. Morrison. The contact information section is mostly blank. Just says local photographer, with no address or phone number listed. Ken thanked Mrs. Chen and asked her to call if she remembered anything else. After hanging up, he sat staring at the photo, now certain he was looking at the face of the man who had taken his daughter. The question was, who was Thomas Garrett and where was he now? Ken spent the rest of the morning going through his old address book, searching for contact information for Jessica's friends from high school. Most of the numbers were outdated, but he managed to track down Rachel Patterson, Jessica's best friend, through social media. Rachel, now Rachel Martinez, was living in Seattle with her husband and 2 children. When Ken called and explained what he had discovered, Rachel's voice immediately became emotional. She remembered the yearbook photo clearly and had always felt uncomfortable about that particular night, though she had never been able to articulate why. Mr. Morrison, I'm so glad you called, Rachel said, her voice trembling slightly. I've thought about Jessica every single day for 20 years. That photographer you're asking about, I remember him now that you mention it. He made all of us girls very uncomfortable during the production. Ken's grip tightened on the phone. Uncomfortable how, Rachel? He was always positioning himself to get shots of Jessica specifically. At first, we thought it was because she had the lead role, but it became obvious that he was following her around with his camera more than anyone else. Jessica mentioned it to me several times during rehearsals. Rachel paused, and Ken could hear her taking a deep breath before continuing. There was this one incident that really bothered Jessica. It was about a week before she disappeared. We were leaving school after drama practice and we saw his car in the parking lot. Jessica noticed he had been taking pictures of students as they left the building, but when we walked past his car, we could see he had photos spread out on his dashboard. Photos of what? Ken asked, though he dreaded the answer. Photos of Jessica. Lots of them. Not just from the play, but candid shots that looked like they were taken from a distance. Photos of her at her locker, walking to classes, eating lunch with friends. Jessica was really freaked out by it, but when we looked back, he had quickly gathered them up and driven away. Ken felt sick to his stomach. This man had been stalking his daughter for weeks, possibly months, before her disappearance. Did Jessica report this to anyone? The school? The police? She mentioned it to Mrs. Williams, the drama teacher, but Mrs. Williams said he was just being thorough in documenting the production. She suggested Jessica was being overly sensitive. You have to understand, Mr. Morrison, this was 1992. We didn't have the same awareness about stalkers and predators that we do now. Rachel's voice became more urgent. But there's something else, something I've never told anyone because I wasn't sure if it mattered. The day Jessica disappeared, I saw that same car parked near the bus stop where she usually waited. I was running late that day, so I was about a block behind her. I saw Jessica approach the car and talk to someone through the driver's window. Ken's heart stopped. She got in the car? I don't know for sure. A city bus blocked my view for a few seconds, and when it passed, both Jessica and the car were gone. I always wondered if she had decided to accept a ride home instead of taking the bus. But when the police asked if anyone had seen Jessica after school, I mentioned the car, and they said she probably just caught an earlier bus. The pieces were falling into place with horrifying clarity. This Thomas Garrett had spent weeks studying Jessica's routines, learning her schedule, and gaining her trust through his legitimate role as the drama production photographer. On the day she disappeared, he had positioned himself at her bus stop and convinced her to get into his car. Rachel, can you remember anything specific about the car? Make, model, color? It was dark blue or black, kind of boxy looking. Like a sedan from the 80s. I remember thinking it looked older than what most people were driving then. Ken wrote down every detail Rachel could remember, his hands shaking as he realized how close they had come to solving Jessica's disappearance 20 years ago. If the police had taken Rachel's observations more seriously, if they had investigated this mysterious photographer more thoroughly, Jessica might have been found. Now Ken had to decide whether to contact the police with this new information, or try to track down Thomas Garrett himself. Ken spent the evening wrestling with his decision before finally calling the Millfield Police Department the next morning. The desk sergeant transferred him to Detective Sarah Coleman, a woman in her 40s who had joined the force 5 years after Jessica's disappearance but had inherited several cold cases, including Jessica's file. Detective Coleman listened intently as Ken explained his discovery in the yearbook and Rachel's recollections about the mysterious photographer. When he finished, there was a long pause before she spoke. Mr. Morrison, I've reviewed your daughter's case file multiple times since I took over cold cases. I have to be honest with you, the original investigation had some significant gaps. The detective who handled Jessica's case retired in 1998, and some of his methods were, let's say they reflected different priorities from that era. Ken felt a mixture of vindication and frustration. What do you mean by different priorities? The initial report classified Jessica as a probable runaway within 48 hours. Once that determination was made, resources were shifted elsewhere. The interview with Rachel Patterson that you mentioned was conducted over the phone and lasted less than 10 minutes. Her observation about the car was noted but never followed up on. Detective Coleman's tone became more serious. The photograph you discovered in the yearbook is the first concrete lead we've had in this case in 2 decades. With your permission, I'd like to reopen Jessica's case officially and launch a proper investigation into this Thomas Garrett. Ken's heart raced with hope and anxiety. What would that involve? First, I want to examine the yearbook myself and have our forensics team see if they can enhance the image of this man. We also need to track down anyone else who was involved in the drama production that year, other students, teachers, parents who might remember him. Most importantly, we need to find out if Thomas Garrett was his real name. Detective Coleman paused, and Ken could hear papers rustling in the background. Mr. Morrison, I need to prepare you for the possibility that this investigation might uncover difficult truths. 20 years is a long time, and if this man was responsible for Jessica's disappearance, we may be looking at a worst-case scenario. Ken had lived with that possibility for 2 decades, but hearing it stated so directly still hit him like a physical blow. I understand, Detective. Sandra and I just need to know what happened to our daughter. There's something else, Detective Coleman continued. The fact that this man operated under the guise of a photographer, gained access to a school environment, and appeared to target a specific student suggests a level of planning and sophistication that concerns me. If he was responsible for Jessica's disappearance, she may not have been his only victim. The implication of her words sent a chill through Ken. The thought that other families might have endured the same nightmare, that other daughters might have been taken by the same predator, made his discovery feel even more urgent. I can be at the station within an hour with the yearbook, Ken said. Actually, Mr. Morrison, I'd prefer to come to you. I want to see the yearbook in its original context, and I'd like to look through any other materials you might have from that time period. Sometimes families preserve evidence without realizing its significance. 2 hours later, Detective Coleman arrived at the Morrison house. She was a tall woman with graying brown hair and sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to take in every detail of her surroundings. Ken led her to his study, where he had laid out the yearbook along with Jessica's other belongings. Detective Coleman examined the photograph with a magnifying glass and a small UV light she had brought with her. This is definitely our best lead, she said after several minutes of careful study. I'm going to have our digital forensics team work on enhancing this image. We should be able to get a much clearer picture of this man's face. She looked up at Ken with an expression that mixed professional determination with genuine compassion. Mr. Morrison, I want you to know that I'm going to pursue this with everything I have. Jessica deserves justice, and your family deserves answers. For the first time in 20 years, Ken Morrison felt something he had almost forgotten: hope. 3 days later, Detective Coleman called Ken with news that would fundamentally change everything they thought they knew about Jessica's disappearance. The digital forensics team had worked around the clock to enhance the yearbook photograph, and what they discovered was far more disturbing than anyone had anticipated. Mr. Morrison, I need you to come to the station, Detective Coleman said, her voice carrying a weight that made Ken's stomach tighten. We've made significant progress with the photograph, but there are some things I need to show you in person. Ken arrived at the Millfield Police Department 30 minutes later, his hands trembling slightly as he walked through the familiar corridors he hadn't seen in over a decade. Detective Coleman met him at the front desk and led him to a conference room where a large computer monitor displayed the enhanced image. The difference was startling. What had been a blurry, partially obscured figure in the original yearbook photo was now clearly visible. The man appeared to be in his mid-30s, with dark hair, pale skin, and distinctive facial features that would be recognizable to anyone who knew him. But what made Ken's blood run cold was the expression on the man's face as he stared at Jessica, an intensity that was unmistakably predatory. That's not all, Detective Coleman said, moving to another image on the screen. Our team was able to enhance the object he's holding in his hand. It's a professional camera with a telephoto lens, but look at this. She zoomed in on the camera, and Ken could see that it was pointed directly at Jessica, even though the man appeared to be standing casually at the edge of the group. He had been photographing her during what should have been a celebratory moment with her fellow cast members. We ran the enhanced image through our facial recognition database, Detective Coleman continued. We didn't get a match for Thomas Garrett, which confirms that name was likely an alias. However, we did get a hit from a different angle. She clicked to another screen showing a police booking photo from 1989. The face was unmistakably the same man, though 3 years younger. Meet Robert Vincent Massey, arrested in Eugene, Oregon in 1989 for stalking a 15-year-old girl. The charges were dropped when the family moved out of state and declined to testify. Ken stared at the booking photo, memorizing every detail of the face that had haunted the edges of his daughter's final months. What else do you know about him? That's where it gets more complicated, Detective Coleman said, her expression grim. Massey disappeared from Eugene shortly after the charges were dropped. No forwarding address, no employment records, no trace of him anywhere until he apparently resurfaced in Millfield as Thomas Garrett in 1992. She pulled up another file on the computer. But here's what really concerns me. I've been reaching out to other law enforcement agencies in Oregon and Washington, sharing Massey's photograph and the details of his MO. In the past 48 hours, I've received calls from detectives in 3 different counties who have similar unsolved cases. Detective Coleman's voice became more intense. Salem, Oregon, 1988 16-year-old Michelle Torres disappeared after drama practice. Bellingham, Washington, 1994 17-year-old Amy Chen vanished on her way home from school. Both cases involved reports of a mysterious photographer who had been seen around the schools in the weeks before the disappearances. Ken felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was hearing. Jessica hadn't been this monster's only victim. There had been others, and there might be more they hadn't discovered yet. The good news, if we can call it that, is that we now have a clear photograph and a real name, Detective Coleman said. I've contacted the FBI to see if they have any additional information about Robert Massey, and I've issued a BOLO alert to law enforcement agencies across the Pacific Northwest. She turned to face Ken directly. Mr. Morrison, I need you to understand that this investigation is going to attract significant attention. Once word gets out that we're looking for a suspected serial predator, the media will become involved. Are you and Sandra prepared for that? Ken nodded without hesitation. If it helps find Jessica or prevents him from hurting anyone else, then yes. We're ready for whatever comes next. Detective Coleman smiled grimly. Good, because tomorrow we're going to start interviewing everyone who was at Millfield High in 1992. Someone else must remember Robert Massey, and someone might know where he went after Jessica disappeared. The next morning, Detective Coleman began her systematic interviews with former Millfield High staff and students from 1992. Her first stop was Patricia Williams, the retired drama teacher who had directed Our Town and had dismissed Jessica's concerns about the photographer. Mrs. Williams, now 73 and living in a retirement community outside Portland, agreed to meet with the detective at her small apartment. Mrs. Williams was a frail woman with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that still held the intensity of someone who had spent decades managing teenagers. When Detective Coleman showed her the enhanced photograph of Robert Massey, the color drained from the elderly woman's face. "Oh my God," Mrs. Williams whispered, her hands trembling as she stared at the image. "I remember him now. I remember everything." Detective Coleman leaned forward, sensing that Mrs. Williams had been carrying a burden for 20 years. "What do you remember, Mrs. Williams?" The retired teacher was silent for a long moment, her eyes focused on something far beyond the walls of her small apartment. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "He didn't just volunteer to photograph the play," she said slowly. "He approached me about 6 weeks before the production, claiming to be a freelance photographer who specialized in school events. He said he wanted to build a portfolio of high school theater productions and offered to photograph our play for free." Mrs. Williams stood up and walked to her kitchen, returning with a glass of water that she gripped tightly with both hands. "What I never told anyone was that he specifically asked about Jessica. He claimed he had heard she was a talented young actress and wanted to make sure he captured her performance properly." Detective Coleman felt her pulse quicken. "He knew about Jessica before he even met her?" "Yes, and that should have been my first warning sign. But I was so focused on making the production successful, and the offer of professional photography seemed like such a wonderful opportunity for the students." Mrs. Williams's voice cracked with emotion. "I was a fool." The detective waited patiently as Mrs. Williams composed herself. The guilt that had been eating away at this woman for 2 decades was evident in every line of her weathered face. "There's more," Mrs. Williams continued. "About a week before Jessica disappeared, I found him in my classroom after hours. He claimed he was looking for a script he had left behind, but I caught him going through my desk drawers where I kept student information sheets." Detective Coleman's blood ran cold. Student information sheets would have contained home addresses, phone numbers, and emergency contact details. Those sheets had Jessica's address on them? All the students' personal information was there. Home addresses, parents' work schedules, after-school activities. Mrs. Williams buried her face in her hands. When Jessica came to me worried about him taking too many pictures of her, I should have listened. I should have protected her. Mrs. Williams looked up at Detective Coleman with tears streaming down her face. After Jessica disappeared, I kept thinking about that night I found him in my classroom. I wondered if he had copied down her information, but I convinced myself I was being paranoid. The police seemed so certain she had run away. Detective Coleman made detailed notes as Mrs. Williams continued her painful confession. The retired teacher revealed that Massey had been unusually interested in Jessica's schedule, asking specific questions about when she stayed late for rehearsals and how she typically got home from school. He even asked me about her family situation, Mrs. Williams said. Whether her parents were strict, whether she seemed happy at home. At the time, I thought he was just being thorough about understanding his subjects for better photographs. The detective realized that Massey had spent weeks gathering intelligence about Jessica, learning everything he could about her routines, her family, and her vulnerabilities. He had used his position as a volunteer photographer to gain access not just to Jessica herself, but to detailed information about her personal life. Mrs. Williams, do you remember anything else about him? Did he mention where he lived, what kind of car he drove, any personal details? The elderly woman closed her eyes, concentrating. He always parked behind the school, near the maintenance building where most people wouldn't notice his car. I only saw it once when I was leaving late one evening. It was an older sedan, dark-colored. And there was something else. She paused, her forehead creased with the effort of remembering. He mentioned once that he traveled frequently for his photography work, that he specialized in documenting small-town events. I think he said something about having clients in several states. Detective Coleman realized they weren't just dealing with a local predator, but someone who operated across state lines, moving from town to town, using the same methods to select and approach his victims. That evening, Detective Coleman received a call that would change the entire scope of the investigation. Special Agent Maria Santos from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit had been reviewing the information Coleman had submitted about Robert Vincent Massey, and what she discovered sent shockwaves through the federal database. Detective Coleman, we need to talk immediately, Agent Santos said, her voice carrying an urgency that made Coleman's stomach tighten. The man you're looking for isn't just connected to a few missing girls in the Pacific Northwest. We believe he's been operating for over 3 decades. Agent Santos arrived in Millfield the following morning, accompanied by Agent David Park, a specialist in crimes against children. They met with Detective Coleman and Ken Morrison at the police station, spreading a thick file across the conference table that would reveal the true scope of Robert Massey's crimes. What we're about to show you is going to be difficult to process, Agent Santos warned, looking directly at Ken. But I want you to understand that your discovery of that yearbook photograph may have broken open one of the longest-running predator cases we've encountered. Agent Santos opened the file to reveal a timeline that stretched back to 1975. Robert Vincent Massey, born 1954 in Sacramento, California. His first known offense was in 1979 when he was arrested for photographing children at a playground without permission. The charges were dropped due to insufficient evidence. She pointed to a series of entries on the timeline. From 1980 to 1992, we have reports from 7 different states of missing teenage girls, all between the ages of 15 and 17. In each case, witnesses reported seeing a man with photography equipment in the vicinity of the victims' schools in the weeks before they disappeared. Ken stared at the timeline, his hands clenched into fists. Jessica's case was just one entry among many, representing years of terror that one man had inflicted on families across the country. Agent Park took over the presentation. Massey's pattern was consistent. He would arrive in a small town, establish himself as a freelance photographer interested in documenting local events, particularly school activities. He would volunteer his services to gain access to teenagers, spending weeks studying his target before making his move. Detective Coleman studied the files spread across the table. How many victims are we talking about? Confirmed missing persons that fit his pattern? 12 girls over 22 years, Agent Santos replied grimly. But we suspect there may be more that we haven't connected yet. Agent Santos pulled out another document. The reason we never caught him was his mobility and his patience. He would spend months in a location, sometimes up to a year, carefully selecting his victim and planning his approach. After each disappearance, he would relocate to a different state, often waiting 2 or 3 years before striking again. Ken's voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. What happened to them? To Jessica and the others? Agent Park's expression was compassionate but honest. Mr. Morrison, based on our profile of Massey and the fact that none of these girls have ever been found, we have to assume the worst. This man is what we classify as an organized killer who takes victims for his own gratification. The room fell silent as the weight of those words settled over everyone present. Ken had spent 20 years hoping that Jessica was alive somewhere, perhaps suffering from amnesia or living under a different identity. The reality that Agent Park was presenting destroyed those last vestiges of hope. However, Agent Santos continued, "There's something different about Jessica's case that gives us our best chance of finding him." She pulled out the enhanced yearbook photograph. "This is the clearest image we have of Massey from any of his crime scenes. In every other case he was more careful about avoiding cameras. The fact that he allowed himself to be photographed suggests he was becoming overconfident, possibly making other mistakes as well." Agent Santos leaned forward, her eyes intense. "Mr. Morrison, your daughter's case might be the key to finally bringing this monster to justice. But we're going to need your help, and it's going to require you to do something that may be very difficult." Ken looked at the federal agents, knowing that whatever they were about to ask of him would be painful, but determined to do anything that might prevent other families from enduring the hell that he and Sandra had lived through. "What do you need me to do?" Agent Santos explained their strategy with the careful precision of someone who had orchestrated similar operations before. The FBI wanted to use the 20-year anniversary of Jessica's disappearance and the discovery of the yearbook photograph to generate massive media attention, hoping to flush Robert Massey out of hiding. "We believe Massey is still alive and likely still active," Agent Santos said, spreading several documents across the table. "Men like him don't simply stop. He's probably changed his appearance and his methods, but he's out there somewhere and he's watching." The plan was ambitious and risky. Ken would appear on national television programs, sharing the story of finding the photograph in Jessica's yearbook and revealing Massey's true identity. The FBI would simultaneously release Massey's photograph to every major news outlet in the country, along with age progression images showing what he might look like today. "The goal is to make him feel trapped," Agent Park explained. "Predators like Massey rely on anonymity and the ability to reinvent themselves in new locations. If his face is plastered across every television screen and newspaper in America, he'll have nowhere to hide." Ken understood the logic, but the thought of reliving Jessica's disappearance on national television made his stomach churn. What if this just drives him deeper underground? What if he changes his appearance and disappears completely? "That's a risk," Agent Santos admitted. "But we have another angle. We're going to announce a substantial reward for information leading to his capture. Money has a way of motivating people to come forward with information they might otherwise keep to themselves." The agents had already contacted the television program America's Most Wanted and several national news magazines. The story of the yearbook discovery had all the elements that would capture public attention: a father's 20-year search for answers, a predator hiding in plain sight, and the possibility that dozens of families might finally get closure. "There's something else," Agent Santos said, her voice becoming more serious. "We've been analyzing Massey's movement patterns from the 1980s and early 1990s. He seemed to favor small towns in the Pacific Northwest, particularly communities with populations between 10,000 and 30,000 people." She pulled out a map marked with red pins indicating locations where Massey had been active. "Look at the pattern. He never stayed in the same state for consecutive crimes, but he always returned to this region. We think he has some kind of base of operations here, possibly property he owns or a long-term residence where he feels safe." Detective Coleman studied the map intently. "So he might still be in the area?" "It's possible. Men like Massey often return to familiar territory as they age. The thrill-seeking behavior that drives them to commit crimes also makes them creatures of habit in other ways." Agent Park opened another file. "We've been working with local real estate offices and property tax records, looking for any properties purchased by Robert Massey or any of his known aliases. It's a long shot, but sometimes these guys get sloppy about covering their financial tracks." Ken felt a mixture of excitement and terror at the prospect of Massey being so close. The idea that his daughter's killer might have been living within driving distance of Millfield for the past 20 years was almost too much to bear. "When do we start?" Ken asked, his voice steady despite the emotional turmoil he was experiencing. "The first interview is scheduled for tomorrow afternoon," Agent Santos replied. "A producer from Channel 8 News in Portland wants to do an exclusive story before it goes national. Are you ready for this, Mr. Morrison?" Ken thought about Sandra, who had supported his decision to pursue this investigation even though it meant reopening wounds that had never properly healed. He thought about the other families whose daughters had been taken by the same monster. Most of all, he thought about Jessica, and the promise he had made to her memory that he would never stop searching for the truth. "I'm ready," Ken said firmly. "Let's bring this bastard home." The television interview aired on Friday evening, and by Saturday morning, the FBI tip line was flooded with calls from across the country. Ken sat in the Millfield Police Department with Detective Coleman and the federal agents, listening as they processed the incoming information. Most calls were well-intentioned but unhelpful people who thought they recognized Massey from old encounters or distant memories that couldn't be verified. But at 11:30 a.m., Agent Santos received a call that changed everything. "This is Margaret Hensley calling from Ashland, Oregon," the woman said, her voice shaky but determined. "I saw the news story about Robert Massey last night, and I think he's been living next door to me for the past 8 years. Agent Santos immediately put the call on speaker. "Mrs. Hensley, can you tell me why you believe your neighbor is the man we're looking for? His name is Robert Mason now, but when I saw that photograph on television, I knew it was him. He's older and has gray hair now, but those eyes are the same. And there's something else, he has a photography studio in his basement. I've seen him carrying camera equipment in and out of his house for years." The agents exchanged significant glances. Ashland, Oregon was only 4 hours from Millfield, well within the geographic pattern they had identified. "Mrs. Hensley, can you describe your neighbor's behavior? Has he ever done anything that made you uncomfortable?" There was a pause before the woman continued. "He's always been quiet, keeps to himself mostly. But there have been things that bothered me. He pays a lot of attention to the teenage girls in the neighborhood, always offering to take their pictures for school projects or family portraits. And he seems to know their schedules, when they walk to school, when they come home from activities." Agent Park was already pulling up property records on his laptop. "Mrs. Hensley, what's the exact address of your neighbor's house?" 1247 Siskiyou Boulevard. "It's a blue house with white trim, sits back from the road with a lot of trees around it. Very private." Agent Santos kept the woman on the line while Agent Park confirmed the property information. The house was registered to Robert D. Mason, purchased in 2004 with cash. There was no previous address listed for Mason, and no credit history prior to the property purchase, classic signs of someone living under an assumed identity. "Mrs. Hensley, this is very important," Agent Santos said. "We need you to act completely normal around your neighbor. Don't do anything that might make him suspicious. Can you do that for us?" "Of course. But please tell me you're going to arrest him soon. If he really is the man who took that girl from Millfield, then the children in our neighborhood aren't safe." After ending the call, the room erupted in controlled activity. Agent Santos was already coordinating with the FBI field office in Medford, while Agent Park contacted the Oregon State Police to establish surveillance on the Ashland property. Detective Coleman called Ken's cell phone to bring him back to the station immediately. Within 3 hours, a joint task force was assembled. Surveillance teams were positioned around the Siskiyou Boulevard address, while agents worked to obtain search warrants for both the house and any vehicles registered to Robert Mason. Ken arrived at the police station to find the conference room transformed into a command center. Maps, photographs, and communication equipment covered every available surface. For the first time in 20 years, law enforcement was closing in on the man who had destroyed his family. Agent Santos briefed Ken on the developments. "We've confirmed through utility records that Robert Mason has been living at this address since 2004. That's just 12 years after Jessica disappeared. The timing fits perfectly with our theory that he went underground for a while after your daughter's case but eventually resurfaced in a new location." Agent Park looked up from his computer screen. "We've also discovered something interesting. Mason has been running a small photography business out of his home, advertising portrait services for local families. His client list includes several families with teenage daughters." The implications were terrifying. If this was indeed Robert Massey, he had been operating under everyone's noses for nearly a decade, using the same methods that had allowed him to target Jessica 20 years earlier. "When do you move in?" Ken asked, his voice tight with anticipation and dread. "Tomorrow morning at dawn," Agent Santos replied. "We want to catch him before he has a chance to destroy evidence or run." At 5:47 a.m. on Sunday morning, a coordinated team of FBI agents and Oregon State Police surrounded the blue house on Siskiyou Boulevard. Ken Morrison sat in an unmarked vehicle 3 blocks away, listening to the radio chatter as the operation unfolded. Agent Santos had insisted he remain at a safe distance, but she understood his need to be present for this moment. The tactical team moved swiftly and silently through the pre-dawn darkness. Agents positioned themselves at every exit while others prepared to breach the front door. The neighborhood was quiet, most residents still asleep, unaware that a decades-long manhunt was about to reach its conclusion on their peaceful street. Alpha team in position, came the first radio transmission. Suspect's vehicle is in the driveway. Lights are off in the house. Agent Santos's voice crackled through the radio from the command post. All teams, you are cleared to proceed. Remember, we need him alive. This man has information about multiple victims. The front door splintered as the tactical team executed their entry. Ken could hear shouting in the background of the radio transmission's FBI. Search warrant. Get on the ground. Followed by the sounds of rapid movement through the house. For several agonizing minutes, there was only fragmentary communication as teams cleared each room. Ken gripped the radio tighter, his heart pounding as he waited to learn whether the man they had been hunting for 20 years was finally in custody. Suspect in custody, came the announcement that Ken had been waiting 2 decades to hear. Robert Mason, also known as Robert Vincent Massey, is under arrest. The relief that washed over Ken was so intense that he had to lean against the car to stay upright. After 20 years of wondering, searching, and hoping, the man who had taken Jessica was finally caught. But the radio transmissions continued, and what the agents discovered inside the house was far worse than anyone had anticipated. Command, we need additional evidence teams and forensics units immediately. Agent Park's voice came through the radio, tense and urgent. We found a basement workshop with extensive photographic equipment and what appears to be a significant collection of images. Ken felt his stomach lurch. He knew what that meant. Massey had been documenting his crimes, keeping trophies of his victims just as the FBI profilers had predicted. Agent Santos returned to Ken's location 30 minutes later, her face grim. We have him, Mr. Morrison. Robert Massey is in custody and being transported to the federal detention facility in Portland. But I need to prepare you for what we found in his house. She showed Ken several evidence bags containing photographs. Even through the plastic, Ken could see they were surveillance photos of young girls, taken from a distance without their knowledge. The images showed girls walking to school, playing in parks, and going about their daily lives, completely unaware they were being watched and documented by a predator. We found over 3,000 photographs, Agent Santos said quietly. Images of girls from multiple states, spanning several decades. We also found detailed notes about their schedules, their families, and their routines. Ken forced himself to ask the question he dreaded. Did you find anything of Jessica's? Agent Santos nodded solemnly. We found a file labeled with her name. It contains surveillance photos of her taken in the weeks before she disappeared, copies of her school records that he somehow obtained, and detailed notes about her daily routine. The evidence confirmed what they had suspected. Massey had been stalking Jessica for weeks before her disappearance, learning everything about her life in preparation for the moment when he would take her. Mr. Morrison, Agent Santos continued, we also found something else. There's a locked room in the basement that we haven't been able to access yet. Massey isn't talking, but we believe it may contain evidence related to what happened to Jessica and the other victims. Ken felt a mixture of hope and terror. Part of him desperately wanted to know what had happened to Jessica, to finally have answers after 20 years of uncertainty. But another part of him feared that the truth would be more horrible than the questions that had haunted him for so long. When will you be able to get into that room? Ken asked. The locksmith is on his way. We should know what's in there within the next few hours. At 2:15 p.m., the locksmith finally breached the door to Massey's sealed basement room. Agent Santos called Ken immediately, her voice heavy with the weight of what the team had discovered. Mr. Morrison, we need you to come to the Ashland Police Department. There are things we need to discuss in person. Ken made the 4-hour drive to Ashland in a state of numb anticipation. When he arrived at the police station, Agent Santos and Agent Park were waiting for him in a small conference room, their faces bearing the expressions of people who had seen something that would haunt them forever. Before we begin, Agent Santos said gently, I want you to know that we found evidence that confirms Jessica is gone. I'm sorry, Mr. Morrison. After 20 years, I know you held on to hope, but we can finally give you definitive answers. Ken nodded, his throat too tight to speak. Part of him had known this moment would come, but hearing the words still felt like a physical blow. Agent Park opened a file and showed Ken several evidence bags. In the locked room, we found personal items that belonged to Jessica and the other victims. Her high school ring, a necklace with her initials, and a small diary that she apparently kept with her the day she disappeared. Ken stared at Jessica's belongings through the clear plastic evidence bags. These were the last things his daughter had touched, items that had been with her in her final moments. The sight of them made 20 years of grief come flooding back with renewed intensity. We also found detailed journals that Massey kept documenting each of his crimes, Agent Santos continued. He wrote extensively about Jessica, describing how he selected her, how he approached her at the bus stop, and what happened afterward. Agent Park's voice was clinical but compassionate. According to his writings, Jessica fought back when she realized what was happening. She tried to escape from his car when he stopped at a remote location. Massey wrote that he never intended for her to die, but that she forced his hand when she threatened to identify him to police. Ken closed his eyes, imagining his daughter's final moments of terror and her desperate attempt to survive. The knowledge that Jessica had been brave and defiant in the face of evil provided some small comfort, even as it broke his heart. Where? Ken asked, his voice barely a whisper. Where did he take her? Agent Santos consulted her notes. A remote area near the Cascade National Forest, about 2 hours from Millfield. He buried her body in a location he marked carefully in his journals. We've already dispatched teams to the coordinates he provided. The agents explained that Massey's journals revealed a pattern that was consistent across all 12 victims. He would approach them under the pretense of offering help or a ride, take them to isolated locations, and kill them when they resisted or threatened to expose him. Each victim had fought back in their own way, and each had been silenced by a man who saw them as objects for his gratification rather than human beings with families who loved them. What happens now? Ken asked. Massey will be charged with 12 counts of first-degree murder across multiple states, Agent Santos replied. Given the overwhelming evidence and his detailed confessions in the journals, he'll likely accept a plea agreement to avoid the death penalty. He's already indicated through his attorney that he's willing to cooperate in locating the remains of all his victims. Ken felt a strange sense of closure beginning to form. The questions that had tormented him for 20 years finally had answers, even though those answers brought pain rather than peace. The other families, Ken said. They need to know. We're contacting them now, Agent Park assured him. 12 families will finally be able to lay their daughters to rest and know that their killer will never hurt anyone again. That evening, Ken called Sandra from his hotel room in Ashland. Through tears, he told her that their long search was finally over. Jessica was coming home. 3 days later, Jessica's remains were recovered from the forest location described in Massey's journals. After 20 years, she would finally have the burial she deserved, and her family could begin the long process of healing. 6 months after Robert Vincent Massey's arrest, Jessica Morrison finally came home to Millfield, Oregon. The funeral service was held on a crisp October morning, exactly 20 years and 1 week after she had disappeared. Ken and Sandra Morrison stood at the front of St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, surrounded by family, friends, and community members who had never forgotten the bright 17-year-old girl who had vanished from their midst. The church was filled beyond capacity. Rachel Martinez had flown in from Seattle with her husband and children, bringing flowers and 20 years' worth of memories about her best friend. Mrs. Patricia Williams, the retired drama teacher, sat in the front row, tears streaming down her weathered face as she finally said goodbye to the student she had failed to protect. Detective Sarah Coleman was there, along with Agent Santos and Agent Park, who had become unexpected sources of comfort for the Morrison family during the long months of legal proceedings. Pastor David Reynolds, who had known Jessica as a child, delivered a eulogy that focused not on the tragedy of her death, but on the joy she had brought to the world during her 17 years of life. He spoke about her enthusiasm for helping younger children, her dream of becoming an elementary school teacher, and the infectious laughter that had filled the Morrison house during her childhood. Ken stood to address the congregation, his voice steady despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. 20 years ago, Sandra and I lost our daughter, but we never lost our faith that the truth would eventually be revealed. Jessica's story didn't end with her disappearance. It continued through every person who refused to forget her, every detective who kept her case open, and every stranger who called the FBI tip line when they saw her killer's face on television. He looked out at the faces in the congregation, seeing the same mix of sorrow and determination that had sustained him through 2 decades of searching. Jessica's death was senseless and cruel, but her legacy will be one of protection. Because of what we learned about Robert Massey, other families have been spared the nightmare we endured. Other daughters are safe because Jessica's case finally brought a monster to justice. Sandra spoke next, her voice soft but clear. Our daughter was brave. She fought for her life, and in the end she helped save the lives of others. I take comfort in knowing that Jessica's story will be remembered not just as a tragedy, but as a testament to a father's love and a community's refusal to give up hope. The service concluded with the congregation singing Amazing Grace, Jessica's favorite hymn. As her casket was carried from the church, Ken felt a complex mixture of grief and relief. The questions that had haunted him for 20 years were finally answered, and Jessica could rest in peace. At the graveside, Ken placed his hand on the polished granite headstone that would mark Jessica's final resting place. The inscription read simply, Jessica Morrison, 1975 to 1992. Beloved daughter. Her light lives on. In the months that followed, Ken and Sandra established the Jessica Morrison Foundation, dedicated to supporting families of missing children and funding cold case investigations. They sold their house in Millfield and moved to Portland, where they worked closely with law enforcement agencies to improve protocols for investigating missing persons cases. Robert Vincent Massey pleaded guilty to 12 counts of first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He died of natural causes in his cell 3 years later, taking whatever remaining secrets he possessed to his grave. On quiet evenings, Ken still sometimes found himself looking through Jessica's yearbook, but now the memories brought more comfort than pain. The mysterious figure at the edge of the drama club photograph no longer represented an unsolved mystery, but rather a reminder that truth, no matter how long delayed, eventually finds its way to the surface. Jessica Morrison had finally come home, and her family could begin to heal.